Okay, well, thanks everybody for attending today. We're going to be talking a little bit about how you can accelerate your development life cycles by using Azure. So this is going to be focusing primarily on the SQL database side, talking about some of the technologies there. We'll also look a little bit at the website side, as that does play pretty heavily into development life cycles these days. This is intended to cover it, again, primarily from the developer's perspective. There's actually a session that Jason Strait is going to be doing on Friday that's going to cover a little bit more from a DBA's perspective, how you can work with your databases, get them deployed to Azure, and some of the more production level things that you need to know about using Azure and SQL databases hosted in Azure. So we'll go ahead and get started. I am a SQL Server MVP. I've been working with the SQL Server stack, well, for quite a while now. I have been using Azure more frequently over the last couple of years. As the capabilities there have grown, it's gotten a lot easier to work with and become a much more practical solution. Particularly more recently, since joining Pragmatic Works, I've been focusing on more on product development that surrounds the SQL Server stack, and we're currently using Azure for several initiatives there and having so far pretty good success with it. So today we're going to talk a little bit about why would you want to use the cloud, what are some of the pros and cons to using it, then deploying databases to Azure, again with kind of the developer slant to it, and look at deploying a website. So some of the core reasons to use the cloud, there's less administration involved. My history was as a consultant, and I did a lot of BI projects for a lot of different customers, and one of the biggest challenges that I would find every time I went into a customer to do a project was actually getting the appropriate permissions from the network administrators, getting environments set up, and actually having the pieces that you need to actually get started on your project. So one of the nicest parts about the cloud, at least in my experience, is there's just less red tape and less administration that you have to go through. That doesn't mean that it can't be very tightly controlled and that it doesn't meet security requirements, but what it does mean is you don't have to spend as much time doing setup, getting hardware provisioned, focusing on kind of those low-level network administration functions that are very necessary when you have an on-prem solution. You have to make sure your servers can talk to each other quickly, they can talk to the clients quickly, there's connectivity. A lot of that tends to go away when you're working in the cloud. I have yet to have problems with an Azure website, for example, not being able to communicate to a SQL database hosted in Azure. That connectivity is all managed by Microsoft, and they stay on top of making sure that it's always up and running, and much more redundant, and a lot more effort put into that than a lot of companies can afford to. It's also a cost savings for most companies. Space and power continues to go up. If you have a large data center, the power requirements for both running the hardware as well as cooling it can get extremely expensive. So you're basically taking the money that you would have put toward that and putting it toward the cloud instead, and paying somebody else to deal with those things. So it also gives you a bit more predictability as far as the cost around those things, and you don't have to pay for the data center space directly. Obviously, those types of things come out in the cost of the Azure services, but they're very comparable, and in most cases less expensive than if you had to pull all that in-house and run your own data center, particularly with some of the advantages that you get. The less infrastructure, again, this kind of goes back to the plumbing that we don't necessarily want to think about as developers or SQL developers. The network being up and running is just something we kind of take for granted. Communication paths being fast between our application servers and our database servers. Again, that should just happen In a lot of organizations, though, it doesn't just happen. It's actually a pretty large dedicated team assigned to making that happen. So by putting it in the cloud, you're basically shifting the effort there to somebody else to take care of, and it's kind of nice from the standpoint that it becomes their problem to make sure that's up and running properly. It also reduces costs because you have less licensing expense. So we'll talk about the difference between the IaaS, infrastructure as a service, and the PaaS, platform as a service, in just a second. But with both options, platform as a service and infrastructure as a service, you get certain licenses basically baked into what you're already paying for. So the fee that you pay to use the services includes the cost of licensing. That's not 100%, so there's definitely Microsoft can't make anything too easy when it comes to licensing, but so you do have to do a little bit of research to understand exactly what you're getting with each option. But particularly for the platform as a service, it basically removes the licensing aspect of things as something you have to really give a lot of thought to. You just buy the service, you use the service, the software that's being used under the covers, you don't really have to worry about. Another thing that CIOs and CTOs tend to focus in on about the cloud is this is an operational expense rather than being a capital expense. So this means it has a much more favorable impact on taxes. Things coming out of operational budgets are typically a much easier way to deal with these things. And you're not having to go out and buy a lot of hardware that you now have to depreciate over time, and ending up with something that over time loses value, and at the end of the day is still considered an asset, but realistically, how many of us look at computers that we've had for 5 years and really consider that an asset, or is it just something that's taking up space and you have to figure out a way to get rid of? So with the speed of changes that's still going on in the computer industry, hardware becomes obsolete very quickly. So by shifting this over to more of an operational expense, you're not investing in hardware that you know is going to be out of date very quickly after you buy it. Another big benefit of using the cloud to host your development and to take advantage of it is you have built-in upgrades. So this can be a little scary, but it's also a really big plus. The idea here is that you get upgrades from multiple angles. One angle is as Microsoft rolls out new versions of software like SQL Server. Well, if you're using the Azure SQL database, you get those new features first,